It is the central theme of eugenics. Fewer children from the unfit, more from the fit. And in Hitler's Germany, the fittest of all were men and women with blonde hair, blue eyes, and without a trace of Jewish blood. Under the program known as Lebensborn, adults with these traits were encouraged to produce thousands of babies. Their offspring are now in their 50s and 60s, unwitting symbols of Adolf Hitler's plan for a master race. Join us for Hitler's Perfect Children.
Steinhering, Germany. On the surface, an idyllic Bavarian town, not far from Munich. But for many, it holds the key to an agonizing past.
I knew that I was born in Steinhering. That's my birthplace. But I didn't know what Steinhering was.
Unwilling to be identified, this woman asked to be called Irene. A chance visit to Steinhering Town Hall changed her life.
She showed me the book where it is written that I am born here, and there was the word Lebensborn. And then I got a shock, I think. I said, what? Lebensborn? Me?
Lebensborn. The German word translates to the wellspring or source of life. But for these women and others, it holds a much darker meaning. Lebensborn is the name given to a clandestine Nazi program whose mission is to stockpile the so-called racially pure children of the master race. It is the brainchild of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, Hitler's elite bodyguards and police force.
The Lebensborn project was developed with the underlying ideological aim of making certain that all potential German blood was saved for the future of the race.
The ideal, of course, was that the children born in the Lebensborn program would then go on to become good, productive, healthy German citizens, to be, in many cases, members of the SS.
To the Nazis, good German citizens means only one thing: Aryans.
The image of the perfect Aryan or German or Teutonic person was, of course, tall and blonde and blue-eyed, perhaps modeled after the Scandinavian peoples.
It was clear to anybody who looked at Hitler at the time that he didn't meet the criteria of an Aryan. Obviously, he did not have blonde hair. He was not a particularly great physical specimen. He was short.
The Aryan race, according to mythology, was based on several different groupings, of which the most superior, as the myth went, was the Nordic version of the race. But there were other so-called racial groups. The Nordic, Mediterranean, Alpine, that intermarried over the years, and this was how the Germans explained how so many of them had dark hair and indeed dark eyes and may have been small of stature. The idea for the Nazis, the aim for the Nazis, was to breed out these inferior strains and eventually come up with a purely Nordic race.
To promote this Aryan ideal, the Nazis used the principles of a popular pseudo-science called eugenics that first took root in England and the United States.
Eugenics was not really a science, although it had scientific underpinnings. It was basically a notion, an attempt to somehow enhance human genetics. The basic scientific framework to allow that to be done practically didn't exist.
Proponents of eugenics believe that those with so-called good genes, the intelligent, the healthy, and the morally upright, should be encouraged to have large families. Those with supposedly bad genes, the feeble-minded, the handicapped, and the criminal, should be sterilized or otherwise prevented from passing on their character traits. The first to implement such a program are the Americans.
Eugenic sterilization was first done in the United States. The state of Indiana passed a law in 1907 that sanctioned the sterilization of mentally unfit, so-called mentally unfit people, decades before anything like this was attempted in Germany.
In fact, by 1936, 35 U.S. states had adopted similar laws. The Nazis put their own spin on the movement.
Eugenics went from being about the preservation of the human race to the preservation of the German race and the purification of the German race.
They, therefore, rejected as well the term eugenic because it was not a German word and called it Rassenhygiene, racial hygiene.
In order to ensure the racial purity of the German people, the Nazis begin to pass new laws as soon as they come to power.
The first eugenic racial legislation passed by the new regime in the summer of 1933 was the compulsory sterilization law, modeled to some degree on American precedents. However, implemented, enforced with a Teutonic thoroughness and the authority of an all-powerful state.
This act aims to curb the reproduction of those the regime considers lives unworthy of life, the mentally ill and the congenitally disabled. By the start of World War II, an estimated 320,000 people are sterilized, about 1 in every 200 Germans. In an attempt to further their racist ideals, the Nazis use a massive propaganda campaign. They start with the children at school.
A child who was blonde, blue-eyed, fair-skinned would be brought up in front of the class and have the length of the earlobe measured, cranial capacity measured, eye color measured. Another student not having the same characteristics, and in fact, in some cases, deliberately made to appear to be Jewish, would be brought up and placed beside the other student for the students then to tell the teacher what the differences were and why one was better than the other.
Germans are bombarded with propaganda in posters, magazines, and movies. Everywhere, the Aryan is depicted as physically and morally superior, and nowhere is that superiority more evident than in Heinrich Himmler's SS.
To get into the SS, one had to prove that one's Aryan lineage stretched back to 1800, and if one wanted to be an officer, then they had to go back to 1750 and prove that, for example, there was no Jewish blood in their family tree, that they had no cases of disability or other kinds of disease, congenital diseases in their recent family histories.
SS candidates are subject to rigorous physical examinations and are evaluated by Nazi racial experts.
And saw itself as an elite of pure Germanic men who become the Praetorian guards, if you like, of the regime.
Himmler feels the future of the German people is resting in the hands of his SS. He does everything in his power to ensure that they pass on their healthy Aryan blood. Since before World War II, all SS men need permission to get married, which is granted only if the prospective bride passes both physical examinations and ancestral checks for racial purity.
Himmler considered the SS as the avant-garde of the master race and therefore wanted to encourage them to have as many children as possible. I mean, these were, in Nazi racial terms, these were the fittest and the healthiest and the most racially pure Germans.
And he expected minimum 4 children per SS marriage. And those 4 children were expected to be racially valuable, healthy, vigorous. In order to guarantee that, he insisted that these women be vetted before he or a superior officer would grant permission to marry.
In truth, marital status is not crucial to Himmler. What matters most is that both parents are racially acceptable and capable of producing healthy children. But a problem arises: how to ensure that all these racially pure, illegitimate children have a proper upbringing? The answer is Lebensborn.
The foundation had a mission. to provide aid to mothers who were expecting children, whether these children were legitimate or illegitimate, if the racial purity of their parents could be established.
When we continue, Nazi propaganda urges women to give a baby to the Führer.
Their duty then was to provide as many children as possible for the fatherland.
Obsessed with the idea of creating the master race, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, establishes the Lebensborn Foundation in late 1935. It is a secret breeding experiment, an attempt to encourage his racially valuable SS men to reproduce with similarly pure Aryan women.
The more babies of good blood that were born to the German Reich, the more future soldiers the German Reich would have, and the more future bearers of yet more future soldiers the German Reich would have. And this was presented as a patriotic contribution to the future of the race.
One of the main targets of this pro-NATO propaganda is the BDM, the Bundesdeutsche Mädel, the League of German Girls.
Women who'd come through the BDM and come through Nazi youth organizations were in several ways ideal candidates for the Lebensborn. On the one hand, they were of course pre-approved, Aryan, healthy, racially acceptable young women. On the other hand, they'd been indoctrinated for years.
They were supposed to be aware that they should select a racially valuable partner, and that their duty then was to provide as many children as possible for the fatherland.
Indeed, in the world of selective breeding, every racially pure baby counts.
Lebensborn was closely tied to the attempts to prevent German women from getting abortions. And again, this is really just about Aryan women. It didn't matter to the SS what Jewish women were doing with their babies, if they were aborting them or not. That was of no concern. But the fact that Aryan women were terminating pregnancies was a tremendous thorn in the side of Hitler and Himmler and the SS.
The Lebensborn homes are presented as an ideal place to have a child, as Heinrich Himmler says in a 1939 speech. There they could pass the weeks before the birth of their child in agreeable surroundings and quietly await the great event.
Without question, the pregnant mothers received many benefits from going into a Lebensborn home. They received pre- and postnatal care. They also received the benefit of privacy vis-a-vis society outside. Once they came in, they were not subject to the looks and stares of neighbors and friends and passerbys who knew that they were unwed and pregnant.
The Lebensborn facilities, there are 10 in Germany by the end of the war, are an open secret among the Nazi upper echelon. They are made available to the wives of SS men and to any other pregnant Aryan women who know about them. That is, if they meet the stringent entrance requirements.
In order to get into a maternity home, a pregnant woman had to do several things. One, submit to a physical examination, submit to the ancestral check, which all prospective brides would have to submit to in the SS, but also would have to name the father. And the father, if not an SS man, and therefore not previously vetted in terms of racial purity, find documentation, evidence of racial purity on the part of her partner, which was not always an easy thing to do.
More than half of the pregnant women who apply for admission are turned away. Of those who do get in, the majority are unwed single mothers. By the end of the war, the number of illegitimate births in the Lebensborn homes reportedly reaches as high as 90%. The program is kept secret from the public for precisely this reason.
Himmler and Hitler actually discussed the secrecy of Lebensborn, and their idea was that someday, after the war was over, they would be able to tell Germany what was going on and explain to the people what had happened in the Lebensborn homes. But The reason for the secrecy was that illegitimacy still carried a great stigma.
Himmler uses his role as the chief of German police to protect those who participate in the program. Because the police are responsible for registering newborns, it is easy to falsify the birth certificates. The identities of the SS fathers, and sometimes even the mothers, are often left out of the document. Birthplaces are also covered up. Years later, when the grown Lebensborn children begin searching for their past, these incomplete records will prove to be their greatest obstacle. All children, legitimate or not, born within the confines of the Lebensborn, are technically the property of the SS. There is even a solemn naming ceremony consecrating the children to the service of the SS and the Reich. While most of the married women take their children home with them, many single women choose to leave their children in the care of the Lebensborns.
Most children born in the homes were not kept by their birth parents, one or the other. Most of them ultimately were farmed out, either to foster homes. Some of those in foster homes would subsequently be adopted.
SS men and their wives were, of course, the ideal foster parents because they were both racially pure and physically fit and the most reliable to be good Nazis, to provide a sort of, if you can say this, a good Nazi upbringing, an upbringing for their children perfectly in accordance with the values that the Nazis stressed.
Himmler, despite his role as the head of the SS, still manages to find time to take a personal interest in the day-to-day life at the Lebensborn homes.
There's evidence that he frequently visited the Lebensborn homes, that he demanded frequent reports about the numbers of babies being born, about conditions within the homes.
Children born on his birthday, the 7th of October, received special gifts from the Reichsfuhrer. He became the guardian of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these children. The man loved children, and indeed produced 2 illegitimate children of his own, by way of, I guess, setting an example for his men.
For the children who live in the Lebensborn homes, their days are filled with outdoor activities and Nazi-sanctioned songs and games. They are encouraged to be aggressive, to be active, to be leaders. They are the apple of Himmler's eye.
This is one man who believed in the 1,000-year Reich, and believed it would take about 1,000 years to replenish good German blood. And hence those babies, those young children in those SS maternity homes were to be the future.
When we return, Himmler and the SS look to the occupied countries to reclaim every drop of German blood.
The Norwegian woman was seen as a premium Aryan woman, good blood, blonde. Yeah, so it was a Ur-Aryan, you can call him.
By the early 1940s, the Lebensborn program is being fully implemented. It is clear, however, that not enough children are being produced to suit Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and driving force behind the Lebensborn. Within the walls of this countryside retreat and others like it in Germany, only an estimated 7,500 babies are born through the program.
Himmler tried his best to encourage SS men, even to require SS men to have multiple children. Himmler actually thought that all SS members should have to have 4 children, although the average turns out to be much closer to 1 child for every SS man.
Despite financial incentives to have children and fines for those who didn't, many members of the SS have misgivings about the program. Most of them choose not to produce babies for the state.
A program like Lebensborn involved sanctioning illegitimate births. And here we see 2 Nazi principles coming into contradiction. On the one hand, the principle of maximizing the number of healthy Aryan babies born, and on the other hand, protecting good old-fashioned values like the family.
The Nazis are well aware that the public would not agree with the Lebensborn program and decide to keep it a secret, but rumors begin to spread. Were the SS being put out to stud, to reproduce like prized racehorses?
The Lebensborn homes were clearly not stud farms. The women who went into Lebensborn homes were already pregnant. and they went there to have their babies in a clean and safe setting.
Having failed to produce enough children on the home front, Himmler turned to the German-occupied countries. By the spring of 1940, Germany has invaded Czechoslovakia, Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and France. Himmler has already revealed his plans in a 1938 speech. He says, "I really intend to take German blood from wherever it is to be found in the world, to rob and steal it wherever I can." Though the Nazis attempt to establish Lebensborns in many of the occupied countries, there is great resistance.
France, for example, women who had become pregnant by German personnel discovered that going to these homes might well result in them leaving without their children. They resisted going to them as best they could and managed to indeed quite often elude Lebensborn authorities.
But in marked contrast to other occupied countries is Norway. The government of Prime Minister Vidkun Quisling collaborates with the Nazis, who set up 9 Lebensborn-type homes there, only 1 fewer than in Germany itself. This pleases Himmler greatly, as the women of Scandinavia in particular exhibit the cherished blonde hair and blue eyes of the ideal Nordic strain of Aryan.
When there were sexual liaisons between Germans and Norwegians, there wasn't much doubt, unless the Norwegian happened to be of Jewish ancestry, about the racial suitability of the child to be born.
Tor Brandacker is the product of just such a wartime romance. He is currently the leader of the Norwegian Lebensborn organization.
The Norwegian woman was seen as a premium Aryan woman, good blood, blonde, yeah, so it was a ur-Aryan, you can call it.
Recognizing what is, in their eyes, a racially desirable gold mine, the Nazis proved to be very accommodating.
All the resources the German state have been opened in, so food, doctor, medical care, everything was tip-top. So it was a complete hospital system in the system, just for Lebensborn.
There is, of course, a catch.
They can go to Lebensborn and get birth to the kid anonymous. They've been taken care of, but they have to sign a paper. The kid's been turned over to the German state. You don't get your kid back after he was born. The kid's been sent to Germany, to the foster parents, nursing homes. But it was a way to do it, because of being a lonely girl in a war with a pregnant with a foreign soldier. It was not so easy, you know.
The current estimate is that between 6,000 and 12,000 Nazi-bred children are born in Norway. The Lebensborn program is a greater success here than in Germany itself. In countries not as accommodating as Norway, the Lebensborn Foundation implements a very different strategy. In occupied Poland, for example, they decide that if racially valuable children cannot be bred, they will be stolen.
Polish children became a target of Lebensborn efforts to secure children of good racial ancestry, in part because Germans were all too aware that the Polish East, so to speak, had on occasion been German.
The Lebensborn take in the children the SS finds suitable for Eindeutschung.
The best English translation for Eindeutschung is Germanization, and that is essentially imbuing a person believed to have, quote, German blood, end quote, with, or familiarizing that person with German culture and the things that he or she ought to believe and feel as a person possessive of German blood.
Himmler is confident that the Germanization will be a success. In a 1940 memorandum, he writes, "We are convinced that our own philosophy and ideals will reverberate in the spirit of these children who resemble us racially." The SS are trained to recognize the features of children who have Aryan blood. They keep a constant eye out for these prospective Germans.
The SS, in terms of an occupation and a police function, could go into homes, could go into schools, could go into hospitals, and thereby ascertain that there were some children there who looked to be very German, very Aryan, and could identify them that way.
The SS kidnapped an estimated 200,000 Polish children. They are tested for racial purity and given psychological exams at the SS's Race and Resettlement, or RUSHA, office in Lodz. Children between the age of 6 and 12 are sent to German boarding schools and indoctrination camps similar to the Hitler youth camps. Children under 6 are sent to Lebensborn homes.
These kids were forced to forget their Polish, if that was possible. They were forced to only speak German. They were forced to conform to German culture, to German education as rigorously as possible. And they weren't told about their own origins.
As they do for German children in the Lebensborns, the SS falsify crucial documents for the new arrivals.
A different name for the child, last name in particular, if not both names. In many instances, the birth certificate would not necessarily reflect an actual correct date of birth.
With the evidence of their former Polish lives effectively erased, the children are then adopted or placed in foster homes. In most cases, the German parents are no more aware of their new child's Polish origin than the child. In a 1943 speech, Himmler justifies the Germanization of the Polish children. I think it is our duty to take these children, even if we have to rob or steal them. Either we recover this superior blood and use it ourselves, or we must destroy it. When we continue, the war comes to an end, and Himmler's dream of an Aryan future becomes a nightmare for the Lebensborn children.
When the peace was declared, then they started war against us.
When mothers in the Lebensborn program gave birth to disabled children, the babies were often poisoned or simply allowed to starve.
By April of 1945, American, British, and Russian troops are closing in on Germany. The Wehrmacht, or German army, is forced out of the occupied territories. Outmanned and outgunned, Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year Reich is collapsing.
As the Wehrmacht had to retreat out of the Soviet Union and then out of Eastern Europe and ultimately back into German territory, the Lebensborn homes were evacuated.
Germany's surrender on May 7, 1945, brings to a close any hope of a master race. SS leader Heinrich Himmler attempts to flee Germany, but is captured by British forces. On May 23, 1945, while in custody, he swallows a cyanide capsule and kills himself. In the final days of the war, most Lebensborn records were destroyed, and those that remain are locked in files throughout East and West Germany.
And many children themselves had no idea that they had been born into the Lebensborn program. Often they found out that they were adopted, but didn't know anything more about their own heritage or the circumstances of their own births.
After the war, the adoptive parents tended to keep the identities of Lebensborn children secret, even from the children themselves, for two important reasons. One involved the stigma of illegitimate birth, and reinforcing that particular stigma was a double stigma of association with the Nazi regime.
The children who had been kidnapped from Poland face especially difficult odds in uncovering their past. Because the SS has created false identities and papers for them, finding the true families of these children becomes a nearly impossible task. It is estimated that only 40,000 of the reported 200,000 kidnapped children are returned to Poland.
The Anglo-American authorities were reluctant to break up functioning families if the child had been adopted and was well adjusted in its German family, and this reluctance was further reinforced by the oncoming Cold War and the establishment of a communist regime.
For the thousands of children born in Lebensborn, it will be years before they begin to understand their part in the experiment to create a master race. Helga Corral was born in the Lebensborn home in Steinhering, Germany.
My mother was the most beautiful woman. She was tall and blue-eyed and blonde and very beautiful. She came to Munich in 1934 to work at Martin Bormann as a secretary.
Helga's father was an SS soldier with whom her mother had a brief relationship. After her birth, Helga's mother returns to work in Berlin, while Helga is left in care of a racially suitable foster family.
They were high-ranking Nazis with the staff of the representative of the Führer.
To Helga, the legacy of her Nazi past cannot be forgotten.
I was under the protection of the SS. The first 4 years of my life, I was a member of the SS.
For the children raised in Germany, the legacy of Lebensborn is one of shame and secrecy. But for those born in occupied countries such as Norway, being identified with Germany becomes literally a crime.
When the peace was declared, then they started a war against us and our mother. They put out 9 concentration camps. They arrested 14,000 girls. When the mother was arrested, nobody was there to take care of the kids, because the kids were standing alone, unprotected, hated by everybody, by the state, church, psychiatric, medical expertise, everybody hated them.
With nowhere else to go, many of the children are institutionalized.
What happened in this institution is grotesque. It's out of human mind. Every possible thing a human nature can do, ugly or bad things, pedophiles, sadists, torturists, has been done against innocent kids in Norway.
When we return, the legacy of Lebensborn. Could it have worked?
I think if you try and enrich for blonde hair and blue eyes, you can probably do that. But what do you have when you finish?
Soon after the war, the director of Norway's largest mental hospital declared that any woman who had mated with a German soldier had to be mentally defective. He also concluded that 80% of the children produced by these unions must be mentally retarded as well.
The adult children of the Norwegian Lebensborn program have always known who they were. These children were branded as traitors before they could walk. The very blood which Himmler so treasured has marked them for scorn and abuse ever since, causing irreparable damage.
Alcoholism, drug abuse, suicide. Every month we have somebody who's making suicide. Every month, no, it's stopping. But in 94, 95, every week, I heard some friends jump out the window, drunk themselves to death, overdose. They've been run over by a car. They have hanged themselves, shoot themselves, so on and so on and so on.
A group of Norwegian Lebensborn children are suing their government, claiming that the state looked the other way while thousands of children were being abused.
One of the reasons we find is so we can get a report, official document report, so we can turn over to the next generation Norwegian and say, never, ever, ever, ever do the same thing again. Learn of it.
Unlike the Norwegians, the German children of the Lebensborn were never treated any differently than their peers. Some grew up in foster homes, others were adopted, some were raised by their natural mothers. But in almost every case, the children had no idea that they were the product of an SS breeding experiment. Their mothers were unwilling to discuss it, and their birth fathers seemed to have vanished into thin air.
It was difficult for the Lebensborn children to find their parents, their fathers, after the war, in part because the fathers did not want to be found and did not want to be identified as SS men.
The International Tribunal at Nuremberg declared the SS as an organization to have been criminal, and its members could be prosecuted for membership in the SS. And those who had been members knew that they had to burn or bury or discard their old uniforms.
In addition, birth certificates are incomplete or inaccurate. Records for the Lebensborn have been destroyed or damaged. Grown children of the Lebensborn in Germany only find out about their origins by chance, if at all. Irene, as she is asked to be called, found out that she was a Lebensborn child on a chance visit to Steinhering. Her father was one of the few who did not try to hide his identity.
Last year, when I came to Steinhering first time, I have seen the first time in my life the document where he has acknowledged the fatherhood. And now by this document, I could go to the Berlin Document Center and to search for his file, and I found his file, about 100 pages. And so I know a little more about my father, but it is stopped in December '44, and from that time I have no idea what happened with him.
When she was 42, Irene learned the identity of her birth mother as well and found her living in Leipzig in the former East Germany. Although they speak regularly, too many of Irene's questions remain unanswered.
She had no idea about Lebensborn. I asked her. I met her 3 weeks ago, and I showed her the document. I said, "See, you have signed this document. There's written Lebensborn." And she said, I don't know what it is. I can't believe it. I think it is in a way that she don't want to be touched by this word, Lebensborn.
Unlike Irene, there are still many Germans who have no idea that they may have been a part of the Lebensborn project. And though records were recently made openly available, many do not even know to go looking for them.
In order to discover their origins, Lebensborn children who didn't know they had been Lebensborn children had to have some indication that they weren't who they were. And some of that impetus came as a result of the fall of the wall. The opening of archives in East Germany across the board not only produced a cache here or there of Lebensborn materials, but it also forced a massive reevaluation of a lot of agencies, organizations, and individuals in East Germany.
Now Lebensborn has received some attention, and only now are children who are actually born through the Lebens program, only in recent years have they, in some cases, have they found out about their pasts, have they found out about the program.
Despite their new understanding of their past, the knowledge of being a Lebensborn child is not always easy to bear.
The Lebensborn things nobody can understand. Nobody knows exactly what happened under the word Lebensborn.
It's difficult to live this with this idea. I don't know what happened to the Lebensborn children in Germany, but they had a bad life, I think so.
These children, who were bred to rule the world, may never escape their legacy. Many are illegitimate, and all are linked to the Nazi past. But the question remains, would these people have been the vanguard of the master race? Could Himmler's twisted experiment ever have worked?
It was just a very odd notion, the idea that blonde hairs and blue eyes is somehow the criteria for superior humans. Just makes no sense to virtually anyone who looks at it. I think if you try and enrich for blonde hair and blue eyes, you can probably do that. If you want to eliminate all individuals who are not blonde-haired and blue eyes, you'll certainly enrich the population. It's a very strong selective pressure. But what do you have when you finish?
Given enough time and willing generations of parents, an experiment like Lebensborn could have theoretically succeeded in producing a race of similar-looking children. But there is no evidence to indicate that any scientific advantage resides in having blonde hair and blue eyes, or that a creature known as the Aryan even exists.
The Aryan race is itself just a construct. There is no separation that defines a person genetically as Aryan. Basically, we are all so close to being identical. All humans are so close to being identical genetically that the differences between individuals are far greater than the differences between ethnic and racial groupings.
Misguided or not, the plan to create a master race had only one major precondition that was not met: Germany's victory in the war. How different the lives of the Lebensborn children would have been if, as Himmler dreamed, they had been allowed to take their place as the rulers of the world, a racially pure aristocracy. The fact remains, however, that the legacy of the Lebensborn is only one of shame, pain, and regret.
After the war, the children raised in Norway faced more than just harassment. They were beaten and often institutionalized. In their lawsuit against the government, they're asking for millions of dollars in damages. The Lebensborn children received at least a small measure of satisfaction on the last day of the 20th century when the country's prime minister issued a public apology for the way they were treated. Most Norwegian Lebensborn children consider the apology far too little and much too late.
The basic scientific framework to allow that to be done practically didn't exist.
Proponents of eugenics believe that those with so-called good genes, the intelligent, the healthy, and the morally upright, should be encouraged to have large families. Those with supposedly bad genes, the feeble-minded, the handicapped, and the criminal, should be sterilized or otherwise prevented from passing on their character traits. The first to implement such a program are the Americans.
Eugenic sterilization was first done in the United States. The state of Indiana passed a law in 1907 that sanctioned the sterilization of mentally unfit, so-called mentally unfit people, decades before anything like this was attempted in Germany.
In fact, by 1936, 35 U.S. states had adopted similar laws. The Nazis put their own spin on the movement.
Eugenics went from being about the preservation of the human race to the preservation of the German race and the purification of the German race.
They, therefore, reject
That I was born in Steinhöring, that's my birthplace, but I didn't know what Steinhöring was.
Unwilling to be identified, this woman asked to be called Irene. A chance visit to Steinhöring Town Hall changed her life.
She showed me the book where it is written that I am born here, and there was the word Lebensborn. And then I got a shock, I think. I said, what? Lebensborn? Me?
Lebensborn. The German word translates to the wellspring or source of life. But for these women and others, it holds a much darker meaning. Lebensborn is the name given to a clandestine Nazi program whose mission is to stockpile the so-called racially pure children of the master race. It is the brainchild of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, Hitler's elite bodyguards and police force.
The Lebensborn project was developed
It is the central theme of eugenics. Fewer children from the unfit, more from the fit. And in Hitler's Germany, the fittest of all were men and women with blonde hair, blue eyes, and without a trace of Jewish blood. Under the program known as Lebensborn, adults with these traits were encouraged to produce thousands of babies. Their offspring are now in their 50s and 60s, unwitting symbols of Adolf Hitler's plan for a master race. Join us for Hitler's Perfect Children.
Steinhering, Germany. On the surface, an idyllic Bavarian town, not far from Munich. But for many, it holds the key to an agonizing past.
I knew
With the underlying ideological aim of making certain that all potential German blood was saved for the future of the race.
The ideal, of course, was that the children born in the Lebensborn program would then go on to become good, productive, healthy German citizens, to be, in many cases, members of the SS.
To the Nazis, good German citizens means only one thing: Aryans.
The image of the perfect Aryan or German or Teutonic person was, of course, tall and blonde and blue-eyed, perhaps modeled after the Scandinavian peoples.
It was clear to anybody who looked at Hitler at the time that he didn't meet the criteria of an Aryan. Obviously, he did not have blonde hair. He was not a particularly great physical specimen. He was short.
The Aryan race, according to mythology, was based on several different groupings, of which the most superior, as the myth went, was the Nordic version of the race. But there were other so-called racial groups. The Nordic, Mediterranean, Alpine, that intermarried over the years, and this was how the Germans explained how so many of them had dark hair and indeed dark eyes and may have been small of stature. The idea for the Nazis, the aim for the Nazis, was to breed out these inferior strains and eventually come up with a purely Nordic race.
To promote this Aryan ideal, the Nazis used the principles of a popular pseudo-science called eugenics that first took root in England and the United States.
Eugenics was not really a science, although it had scientific underpinnings. It was basically a notion, an attempt to somehow enhance human genetics.